When Russia rolled into Ukraine, it had a plan. Armor combined with artillery would lead to the collapse of the Ukrainian resistance within days. All Russia had to do was keep the tanks rolling and the shells flying, and there wouldn't be a thing that Ukraine could do about it. Nearly 4 years into the war, we can see that the initial invasion didn't go according to the Russian plan. Once seen as the kings of the battlefield as well as being key to a Russian victory, artillery has taken a backseat to other weapons in the latter half of the war. That's not because Russia doesn't want to use artillery. Just as with tanks, Russia is running out of usable artillery as Ukraine obliterates it all. And 2025 has been Ukraine's best year for that artillery obliteration. That's according to a November 24th report by United 24 Media, which claims that Russia's artillery losses during 2025 have already surpassed the number of unit losses seen in 2024. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense made the revelation on November 23rd, which means that Ukraine still has a month and 7 days to add to its already record-breaking artillery destruction numbers. The Ministry of Defense offers the annual breakdown in its own report. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine as of November 23rd, the number of artillery systems lost and damaged of the Russian army since the beginning of the year has already amounted to 13,053 units, the ministry claims. For comparison, the entire year of 2024, the Defense Forces of Ukraine destroyed 13,050 enemy artillery units. Ukraine has already broken its annual record by 3. And if it keeps the same pace, we can estimate what the true record will be by the end of 2025. The Ministry of Defense report says that the losses recorded are as of November 23rd. That means they've recorded up to November 22nd, which means we can't simply assume 11 months of destruction. However, the period between January 1st and November 22nd accounts for 325 days of the year. If we divide 13,053 artillery units by that number, we get losses of 40.16 artillery units per day. That's staggering for Russia, especially with artillery being such a key part of Putin's strategy. There are 39 days left in the year, counting from November 23rd. If we take our daily loss rate and multiply it by those days, we get another 1,566 units, plus a third of 1 unit, that Ukraine will destroy by the end of 2025, assuming it maintains the pace seen during the rest of the year. That leads to an annual total of just over 14,619 artillery units that Russia will have lost over the course of 12 months. Ukraine hasn't just broken the record it set in 2024, it's absolutely smashed it as Russia's forces are forced to scramble for artillery that is in increasingly short supply. These numbers show us that Ukraine has become extremely effective at dealing with one of Russia's most important weapons, and we even have more numbers to share with you. Sensor.net also reports on the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense claims, and it offers a breakdown by year of the number of artillery units that Russia has lost. It points out that Ukraine had a pretty slow start when it comes to dealing with Russia's artillery. In 2022, it only managed to damage or destroy 2,021 of Russia's artillery units. It was after this point that Ukraine began refining and deploying more of the key weapon it's used to tackle artillery, drones. In 2023, Ukraine tripled its 2022 numbers by smashing 6,461 of Russia's artillery units. That number was more than doubled in 2024, reaching the 13,050 units we mentioned, and there will be another 1,600 broken Russian artillery units in 2025. Beyond those Ukraine has already destroyed, if Ukraine maintains the same pace. This isn't just damaging information for the Russian military, it's outright humiliating. A weapon that was supposed to be capable of destroying Ukraine is instead being reduced to ashes in record numbers. And speaking of records, it should come as no surprise that 2025 has also seen Ukraine break its record for the highest number of Russian artillery units destroyed in a single day. On April 1st, and no, this isn't an April Fool's Day joke, Forbes correspondent David Hambling reported that Ukraine had managed to destroy a staggering 122 Russian artillery pieces in a single day. That's around 3 times the daily average that we calculated for 2025, with the record-breaking day coming on March 28th. That same month also saw Ukraine destroy 1,644 artillery units in 31 days, which Hambling says is triple the number of Russian guns that Ukraine was destroying per month just 18 months prior. These are astonishing numbers. Putin would never have expected to see Russia's artillery destroyed in this type of volume. The question now becomes obvious. With Ukraine destroying so many of Russia's big guns, what impact, if any, is all of this artillery loss having on the Ukraine war? On the artillery shell side of things, the impact appears to be minimal. Russian shells will likely get destroyed along with the artillery that carries them, but shells seem to be one area where Russia isn't in danger of running out. On July 25th, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, or RFE-RL, published an article in which it explored the often claimed notion that Russia is producing 3 times the number of artillery shells in 3 months as NATO nations collectively produce in a single year. No less than NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has made that claim, including during an interview with the New York Times, and the implication seems to be that Russia is building millions of artillery shells annually. RFERL wasn't sure about that claim, so it teamed up with an open-source intelligence group named Conflict Intelligence Team, or CIT, to try to figure out what the real numbers look like. The joint investigation found that Ukrainian and Western officials estimated that Russia was building between 2 and 2.3 million shells annually by 2024, which is close to double the 1.25 million shells it built in 2022. These are impressive numbers, but they also reveal that Russia isn't making as many shells as Rutte implied in his interview. The US makes a little less than 500,000 shells annually, with Europe adding another 700,000 for a yearly total of 1.2 million. For Russia to be making 3 times as many shells in 3 months as NATO makes in a year, Russia would have to be building 20.5 million shells annually. It isn't. However, new Russian factory expansions in several locations, including Kazan and Bielsk, are pushing Russia close to the point where it can make 4 million shells per year. That's a lot of artillery ammunition being made in Russia, and this domestically manufactured ammo is joined by artillery shells from another country, North Korea. That country has been sending artillery shells to Russia even before Russia and North Korea signed a cooperative defense pact that is akin to Article 5 of the NATO Charter. According to the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, North Korea had supplied Russia with 5.8 million artillery rounds between August 2023 and April 15, 2025, which could account for about 40% of the artillery shells that Russia has used in Ukraine during that period. Russian units have come to depend upon deliveries of North Korean ammunition, which may constitute as much as 40% of the 14 million rounds fired since August 2023, RUSI says. It's clear that without North Korean support, Russia's shell hunger would have been far worse, which means that North Korea's illicit activities may have extended the war or even prevented Ukraine from achieving greater success. All of this suggests that Russia has plenty of shells. It's guns that are the problem. However, Russia isn't as healthy as it seems on the shell front either. We highlighted this issue in a recent video where we covered how North Korea hasn't been sending the best ammunition to Russia. In fact, many millions of the shells coming into Russia are rotted to their core and useless for the war. Find out more in our video as we move on to a much larger problem that Russia has, its artillery stockpiles. The sheer scale of big gun losses, which is only getting worse with each passing year of the war, has taken its toll on Russia's artillery stockpiles. In the same article in which it discusses Russia's shell manufacturing, RFERL makes an important point. Shells need guns, and that's becoming a massive issue for Russia. The outlet points out that Russia has spent much of the war relying on its once massive stockpiles of Soviet-era artillery, and the effects on its stockpiles have been stark. For instance, Russia went from having 12,000 units of towed artillery in storage in 2022 to just 6,000 by the middle of 2024, and the number has likely dropped extensively since. Bear in mind that Russia will use the units that are in the best repair first. Those being pulled from storage now are the units that either need extensive repairs or are barely serviceable, let alone effective. By December 6th, this burgeoning artillery shortage was starting to show its impact on the battlefield. On that date, the Kyiv Post published a report stating that Russia's artillery advantage had been drastically cut. Where once Russia was able to rattle off as many as 5 shells to every 1 round that Ukraine fired, the advantage has been cut to just 1.5 rounds per single Ukrainian shell. That can't be due to a shell shortage, assuming all of the numbers we discussed earlier are accurate. Even with rotting North Korean ammo flowing in, Russia still has plenty of shells. So the lower rate of fire must be due to Russia no longer having the artillery units that it needs to send those shells Ukraine's way. There are other factors, of course. A relative lack of artillery is being compounded by production challenges, logistical issues relating to Russian rail, and constant Ukrainian drone strikes on Russia's ammo depots. But it's the shortfall in artillery units that's the main cause of the problem, and Russia losing over 13,000 more big guns in the months since this December 2024 report isn't helping Putin's artillery-heavy strategy. By May, Pravda returned to the issue of Russia's ever-depleting artillery stockpiles, noting that the Soviet-era guns Russia has been deploying can't last forever. It highlights another issue beyond Russia's shell and artillery system supplies. Spare barrels are also needed, especially as Soviet-era barrels wear out quickly when hundreds of rounds are being fired through them. Those barrels, like the guns themselves, were being drawn from Russia's Soviet stockpiles. It adds that some of the artillery systems that Russia has been pulling from its warehouses aren't even making it to the front lines. Rather, they're being stripped of their barrels, which then make the journey to Ukraine to replace barrels on the guns that are still operational. Using low-quality ammunition, such as that provided by North Korea, exacerbates these barrel problems. The main bottleneck in new artillery production is barrels. They require high-precision heavy machine tools and a number of key components. Setting up mass production is not an easy task, Pravda reports. Western sanctions aren't helping Russia in this arena. And of course, Russia isn't being helped by Ukraine breaking records when it comes to destroying the country's artillery units. Russia's artillery situation has become so bad that the Daily Kos claims that the country's artillery advantage over Ukraine will be neutralized by 2026. This doesn't mean that Russia will be out of artillery, rather the ratio of shells fired will be 1-for-1, which it was veering close to by the end of 2024. The same outlet also points to the worn and low-quality barrels issue, which has seen Russia cannibalize its stockpiles just to keep its existing artillery rolling. Only that existing artillery is being destroyed at record rates, and Russia increasingly has nothing left with which to replace it. This is a critical capability loss, the Daily Kos says, and there are several reasons why. As Business Insider said in a March article, artillery has been Russia's god of war for a long time before Putin launched his Ukraine invasion. The outlet points out that the massive reputation that artillery had in Russia before that invasion is one of the reasons why overwhelming artillery fire has been one of the main tactics Russia has deployed during much of the war. Russian officers still see their artillery as the best weapons they have for shattering Ukraine's defenses, breaking through enemy lines and striking fear into their opponents. That's a perception that's hard to break. For the first few years of the Ukraine invasion, that god of war status, which was first coined by Joseph Stalin, appeared to be confirmed. Russia's artillery assaults were rampant, with the sheer number of shells Russia was firing often making up for the tactical ineptitude of the country's soldiers and commanders. At one point, Russia was unleashing volleys of 10,000 shells per day at Ukraine, though that number has since dropped dramatically, as we discussed earlier. An essay written by Dr. Gian Giuseppe Pili, Brett Evans, and Ryder Finn for RUSI expands on the importance of artillery to Russia, not just from a strategic standpoint, but a philosophical one. The significance of artillery in Russian warfare extends beyond its battlefield effectiveness, the trio writes. Through history and to the present moment, its deployment has carried direct political meaning, serving as a visible demonstration of Russia's determination to achieve its objectives, regardless of the level of destruction or civilian casualties involved. Think about this symbolic meaning in the context of Ukraine's record-breaking obliteration of artillery in 2025, and the sheer number of big guns that Russia has lost during the war. Artillery, more than any other weapon besides tanks, has been considered the truest display of Russian military might for decades. To have these symbols of power, which Russia was supposed to be able to use to flatten Ukraine, destroyed in such massive numbers, shatters a massive illusion. Artillery isn't as important as it was during the World Wars and Soviet eras, and it's even less important now that Ukraine has millions of drones. We'll come back to that point in a moment. Russia's perception of artillery as the god of war took a long time to break. Even as recently as July 2024, Forbes contributor Vikram Mittal claimed that artillery was still the king of the battlefield in Ukraine. Both sides relied heavily on artillery, Mittal argued, and he wasn't wrong. They still do, as much as they can, and that reliance is another of the reasons why Ukraine's destruction of so many of Russia's guns is so important. However, Mittal wrote this piece at a time when Russia was firing 10,000 shells per day compared to Ukraine's 2,000. The situation is a lot different now. Russia is still trying to use artillery, but its assaults on Ukrainian settlements increasingly rely less on massive numbers and overwhelming firepower and more on infiltration. We've seen that in Pokrovsk, where Russia has achieved some success by inserting small groups of troops into that city to pull attention away from the assaults emanating from the Pokrovsk outskirts. Russia will tell you this is a brilliant new strategy, but the reality may be that Russia can no longer rely on its trusted god of war, because that supposed god has proven to be a false idol after almost 4 years of warfare. That's because there is a new god of war in Ukraine, and it's a weapon that we mentioned earlier, drones. When sharing the increases in Russia's artillery losses each year since 2022, we mentioned that Ukraine's drones were a major reason for those losses growing as they have. In 2024, Hambling wrote an article for Forbes in which he explored how Ukraine is destroying so much Russian artillery. He points out that destroying an artillery unit has traditionally been a 3-step process. The gun must first be located, after which that information can be sent to command centers so that a weapon can be chosen to tackle the artillery. The third step is that the weapon needs to be able to travel far enough to hit the artillery, often going behind the front lines to do so. In the past, that would usually have meant missiles or long-range precision-guided bombs were the weapons of choice. Russia knew that Ukraine had limited supplies of both, which is why it was so confident that its artillery advantage would count. Drones have been the answer for Ukraine, Hambling says. They weren't a perfect answer, especially earlier in the war. First-person view or FPV drones could only travel around 12 miles, which put a lot of Russia's bigger guns out of range. But as those larger artillery units were destroyed, Russia increasingly relied on smaller caliber 122mm rather than 152mm guns. Those had to be positioned closer, and Ukraine's drones took advantage. Include the addition of long and medium-range drones to Ukraine's arsenal into the equation, and Russia's artillery has become even more vulnerable. Ukraine's reconnaissance drones have also proven themselves very useful for locating Russian artillery, as the commander of Ukraine's Typhoon drone unit, who goes by the name Michael, told Hambling in June. Drones are essential for confirming the exact location of artillery. We use fixed-wing drones, some with real-time video, others capturing high-resolution photos for wide-area reconnaissance. These platforms allow us to assess whether artillery is still in position and provide up-to-date imagery, Michael says. Step 1 of the artillery destruction process that Hambling discussed is made all the quicker when drones can not only locate artillery, but also confirm if it's stationary or on the move in real time. Strikes then become more accurate and effective, even if drones aren't used for the attack portion of the process, and all of this feeds into the massive losses that Ukraine says Russia has experienced. And so we come back to the numbers. Another 13,053 units of Russian artillery are down in 2025, and there will be more before the year is through. Russia has sustained such massive losses that its Soviet-era stockpiles are wearing thin, and manufacturing challenges make it almost impossible for Russia to replenish them while it's still in an active war. The only question left is how long can Russia's god of war stay standing? Because right now, Ukraine has brought the artillery god to its knees. Coming back to Ukraine's drones, the country has just deployed a new unmanned surface vehicle that is AI-powered and has already taken out a massive Russian ammunition stockpile. Ukraine can destroy Russia's artillery shells from the water as well as it can from the air, and you can learn more if you check out this video. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of Russia's growing equipment problems. And thank you for watching.